into it. Software supply chain security. It's a dumpster fire. I said this on a podcast. A lot of people messaged me saying that's a hot take. I frankly don't think it's a hot take at all. I think it's very widely recognized as a dumpster fire, and that's prevalent just by how many questions there are about basic things like what does software supply chain security even mean? If we can't figure that out, how are we going to solve the entirety of it? I also kind of infamously pointed out that the biggest software supply chain security risk of them all is coffee. If we eliminated coffee, your developers are just going to be writing vulnerable code left and right. That's a fact. Getting into the talk, quick background on myself. Of course, my name is Kyle Kelly, founder at CramHacks, which is a weekly software supply chain security newsletter and blog. All I do is software supply chain security. There's not many of us, but those that do exist are fierce and mighty, and we speak loudly on social media, especially when it comes to SBOMs. I do have a master's degree in computer science from Georgia Tech and a number of cybersecurity certifications from my pen testing / consulting days. My friends consider me a linked influencer, which I'm very proud of that little pun. And so if you ever want to reach out to me or complain about some of the things that I'm talking about in this presentation, that's a great place to do it. Yeah, just quick trigger content warning. Opinions are solely my own. They're also definitely subject to change, as they often do. I say a lot of things very flat out. I like debate. I like to encourage debate. I think that's how we learn. And so if I say something, it might not even necessarily be what I truly believe, but I might think that it'll get something out of you. So keep that in mind. And if you do disagree with something, that's awesome. I'd love to discuss it. LinkedIn's a great place to reach out and have those types of conversations. And lastly, I only have 30 minutes, so give me a break on edge cases. As a researcher, I know that every question comes with a, well, sometimes, or sort of, or there's always edge cases. I get that. And so some quick background or definitions on software dependencies and how they relate to software supply chain. Well, there are millions of open source software dependencies, and they're widely used by pretty much everybody. Some of these have 100 million plus weekly downloads. So there's projects that are relying on this open source software that somebody in Nebraska has written, and that is basically the foundation of our application. And Harvard did a study earlier this year, or released a study earlier this year that valued open source software at about $8.8 trillion. Sounds very high, and I would agree with that, but also not like a big sticker shock to me. 62% of libraries found in applications are never used at runtime. My joke here is that everybody is familiar with npm install. Not many people are familiar with npm uninstall. It's just, you install the thing and you realize you don't need it anymore, but who wants to be a code janitor? And in the open source ecosystem, as far as like npm, Maven, Composer, etc., like those types of package ecosystems, GitHub maintains a security advisory database, and they currently have roughly 20,000 relevant vulnerabilities for all those different ecosystems. And definition of what a software dependency is, if you've ever used pip install, npm install, those are software dependencies. There's other less obvious definitions or where the definition kind of conflicts, but for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to focus on these. Then we also have transitive dependencies. So your dependencies also have dependencies. This is important to know. I believe in 2020, GitHub Octoverse report had a study for NPM projects that used 10 direct dependencies, and the total number of dependencies used by that project ended up being 683. So by doing npm install 10 times, there's a very good chance that you're using many, many hundreds of packages. And each one of these gets downloaded and installed on your system and is running code based on the pre-installed scripts and potentially compromising your system. It's a very scary space when you start to see the bigger picture. And one of my favorite definitions by NIST of software vulnerability, a security flaw, glitch, or weakness found in software code that could be exploited by an attacker. I can't emphasize that last piece enough. especially in the SCA space. There's tools even with like reachability analysis. They say, hey, this is a reachable finding. It's a true positive. No, just because it's reachable doesn't mean that it's exploitable. It more than likely requires unsanitized user input for it to be exploitable. And software composition analysis, this is analyzing custom-built software applications to detect embedded open source software and detect if they're up to date, contain security flaws, or have license requirements. That is what most people see software supply chain security in a nutshell. And so, as I just mentioned, what is software supply chain security? Well, the average person says, hey, we need a tool that generates SBOMs and finds vulnerabilities. And that comes with big money bags, thanks partly due to the White House executive order from a couple of years ago and further regulatory compliance requirements saying, hey, we need you to generate an SBOM. And people saying, well, I don't want to hand over an SBOM that has loads of known vulnerabilities. It's like, we need to start cleaning these up and have a better grip of things, which I'm totally in support of. It's not all hype and money driven. There's a serious need for this. But this is number one hot take, because in reality, software supply chain security looks a lot like this. There's many, many other avenues and potential risks and threats. And I just think that it's a letdown that a vast majority of people only see it as this one component, looking at software dependencies and their known vulnerabilities. There's I would argue, bigger threats out there in the space that go unnoticed. And the second hot take is simply, we don't have enough vulnerabilities. Especially at my time at Semgrep, there's people that say, hey, we really need Dart and Flutter support. We write a lot of Dart and Flutter code that uses the pub ecosystem, and we need an SCA tool that identifies vulnerabilities. Okay, well, there's 10 known security advisories for pub, like just 10. You could probably just look at your code and say, hey, am I using one of these 10 packages? Like, that's probably easier than paying for an SCA tool. It could be tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars. When I say 10, these are 10 packages in the pub ecosystem that have a known vulnerability. And those vulnerabilities only affect a specific version or specific versions of the package. So not only do you have to be using the known vulnerable package, but you have to be using the vulnerable version of it. And you also have to be using the affected functions of it. So that's the reachability component. The odds are close, I would say, round down to 0. But we also look at other ecosystems like Rust, for example. There's 135,000 packages, but only 780 known vulnerabilities, or Ruby is about the same. Even if we look at NPM, I put 2.5 million as estimate number of unique packages, but that number is likely much higher. And this is unique packages, not unique versions. In PyPy, for example, on average, there's 10 unique versions or major releases per unique package. So we can pretty safely presume that there's over 20 million NPM packages or releases hosted by NPM, and there's only 3,500 known vulnerabilities. That is not great coverage. We have all these vendors that are looking for vulnerabilities in your code through software dependencies, and we have essentially no vendors that are looking for new vulnerabilities in open source packages. And I'd argue there's almost little incentive to do that because the SCA space already produces so many vulnerabilities. It's already so overwhelming for teams that if you said, hey, I'm going to find more vulnerabilities for you, I don't think customers would be too excited about that. At least those that are more checkbox compliance focused. But I would even argue that SCA entirely is a governance risk compliance tool. Coming from my pen testing days, working with chief risk officers and compliance officers, CISOs, CTOs, et cetera, who owns Tenable? Who owns the network pen testing tool? Usually the risk department, or at least evaluating how information security, there's got to be checks and balances, right? Well, in the security space, the security engineers own SCA to evaluate things like license compliance. That feels like a strange duty for security engineers. Third hot take, transitive dependency vulnerabilities are a waste of time. I feel very, very strongly about this. Probably too strongly, to be honest. But here's an example where Node, the latest version of Node, is using a package called minimist transitively. It ends up that it's actually introduced via test dependencies, so they're not even production dependencies. But if you look, if you run an SCA tool and you're using Node, you may have actually seen this vulnerability, CVE 2021-44906. And so ultimately, minimist versions before and including 1.2.5 are vulnerable to prototype pollution via the file index.js and its function setKey. So we know that there's a specific affected function, which means you're only really impacted if you're using that function. But you're actually not using this package at all. In your first party code, it's introduced 4 layers deep transitively. And that's the case for Node. So Node is actually using minimist in 4 different locations, and in 3 of them, it's using a vulnerable version. And show down here exactly how it's introduced. And so if you didn't notice, makeDirp introduces minimist. And so we're going to focus on how makeDirp uses minimist. And so if we look at the code here, we can see that it is in fact using minimist, and minimist uses setKey from, yes, so, okay, so minimist by default uses setKey, and so minimist is therefore vulnerable in this case. However, one thing to note is that the file we're looking at is node makeDirp bin cmd.js. Now, if you're using makeDirp as a software dependency, you're not using its cmd.js file functionality. You're using its package, and like its node implementation. So actually, when looking at that implementation, it's not using minimist at all, because it wouldn't really make sense to, since minimist is largely used to parse out command arguments. So in reality, if you're ever using minimist as a package, you're likely not using the vulnerable affected function. And why is that a dumpster fire? Because there's packages like Mocha and makeDirp. Mocha has 8 million weekly downloads. makeDirp has 76 million weekly downloads. And each of these are using minimist, as I had just shown. And so those are all pretty much false positives, every single one of them. And that's why there's more than 2,000 GitHub issues referencing this CVE alone. And one of my favorite examples on the NPM CLI project, prototype pollution attacks in a command line parser aren't a vulnerability, because the only person you can attack is yourself. While it's fine if NPM updates this, it's a false positive that users should ignore. This is a maintainer, a contributor that said, hey, this is a false positive. It's not actually exploitable unless you're attacking yourself, which who cares? And the response by the maintainer was agreed, or sorry, this was a contributor. They said agreed, but it's getting flagged in the Node 14 Docker image, and my company prevents containers from starting with critical CVEs after a certain period. Likely easier to fix in Node versus getting an exception. That is terrifying. We have these requirements that just don't make sense logically. Why would we do something just because it's easier than getting an exception? There's no risk involved. There's no need to create these tasks for these open source developers who are already under-resourced. And I think that's largely why supply chain has a bad reputation. And then my last favorite thing about transitive vulnerabilities, how the heck do you even fix them? Well, there's really only 2 ways. One is you hope that your direct dependency upgrades the transitive ones, which removes the vulnerability. Or what I consider to be a bad way is overriding the transitive dependency versions via your project's manifest or lock file. So that would be pinning the versions of your transitive dependencies to use a version that is not intended to be used per your direct dependency. And the reason why I say that's bad is because you don't have a full test suite to ensure that by changing that transitive dependency version that you're not impacting the logic of your direct dependency, which can therefore impact your first party code as well. I would rather have a known, likely mundane or non-exploitable vulnerability than have unknown logic concerns. To me, the unknowns are scarier. Hot take number 4. So security advisories for upstream packages. This one's pretty blanketed. I mean, in the latest CNA rules, they did update this. That made it a little more clear, but there's still a lot of ifs or questions, in my opinion. So this rule states that if a product is affected by a vulnerability because it uses the functionality or specification of another product, then a CNA, and then one of these 3. So must assign a CVE ID to each known vulnerable implementation if there is a secure way of using the functionality or specification. Can somebody please tell me on LinkedIn, what does that mean? What is if there is a secure way of using the functionality or specification? Unless it's malware, there's likely always a safe way of using it. I mean, you could throw a WAF in front of it. You can sanitize user input before it gets to it. You could do all these things. Is that satisfied here? I have no idea. This is mostly focused on the supply chain space, right? So we use software dependencies, but we control how we use them in our first-party code. So essentially, there could always be a way to do something securely. Even if there's a blanket vulnerability, you can patch on whatever you need to prevent that vulnerability. Secondly, must assign a single CVE ID if there is no option to use the functionality or specification in a secure way. So again, kind of the same issue with the definition. Realistically, I'd argue that there's always a way to use something securely, unless it's malicious. And lastly, should assign different CVE IDs to each known vulnerable implementation if the CNA is uncertain whether there is a secure way. So I think this is the case most of the time, or at least should be the case most of the time, partly because we don't know what the definition means. And that leads us to situations like this. So we had 2 vulnerabilities impacting the HTTP2 protocol, one known as continuation flood and one known as rapid reset. Well, for continuation flood, no CVE was assigned to the protocol, but there were dozens of CVEs assigned to affected products. And now for a rapid reset, there was one CVE assigned to the protocol itself and no CVEs assigned to products, at least that I'm aware of. And even in the first case, it's extremely difficult to associate all the different vulnerabilities. So there's over a dozen CVEs assigned to various products, but there's no real simple way of saying, show me all the products affected by this vulnerability. I believe continuation flood is maybe an exception in this case, but when you're looking at lesser known software dependencies, there's rarely correlation. And lastly, number 5, you're probably going to get popped by a malicious dependency within the next few years. I would argue that malicious dependencies is a much greater risk than software dependency vulnerabilities. As I've mentioned throughout this presentation, there's so many if-ands and buts, and you have to be using a software dependency in a very particular way, and you need to pass oftentimes unsanitized user input to the affected function if you're using the affected function. Your SCA tool is likely reporting loads of vulnerabilities for packages that are never even called in your code, as we showed from the contrast security data that revealed 62% are never loaded at runtime. And the list just goes on and on. But what is very apparent is that malicious dependencies are incredibly simple to create and release. I did this for actually 5 major ecosystems. I created a very simple package, and I published it to the package manager or package repositories like npm, PyPy, etc. I just wanted to see how easy is it to get this package hosted by the repository so that people can download it. And in some cases, it took literally seconds. And what's extremely scary is that oftentimes it is doing just flat out code execution. You can have actual bash commands in a setup.py file. And so when you do pip install my package, it will actually just run the bash commands flat out. A lot of people don't recognize that. If you look closely, you'll see that a lot of your packages are running commands on your system, hopefully in a virtual environment. But sometimes, there's a lot of people who aren't doing that. And I think there's a growing, and there already is a massive responsibility from package repositories and package manager solutions, but I think it's definitely growing and becoming more prominent. NPM, PyPy, Packagist, etc. They're doing very little to identify known malicious packages in their ecosystems. I'll say PyPy has been doing a great job in the last year. They've made a lot of advancements. There's been a lot of advancements across the board for things like verifying build attestations. So at least you're making sure what you're downloading is what was uploaded. But there's such a long way to go. And I feel pretty strongly that we're not doing enough in this department. And lastly, this is kind of just an extra one for you. I didn't put number 6 because 5 sounded cooler. But number 6, stop forking your dependencies. This drives me nuts. I have a blog on this where I looked at PyMySQL. There was a specific CVE, and basically I looked for that vulnerable function in all forked versions of PyMySQL, and almost all of them were vulnerable, because when you fork a dependency, you're not automatically ingesting all the later updates. I know a lot of people think it's safer to fork a dependency, but that creates a personal clone, a personal copy of that dependency, which means you lose all of the kind of open source contributions, and especially security advisories. A security advisory doesn't automatically associate itself with all known forks of a package. A CVE only targets one specific asset unless multiple are listed. And that's a very manual process. And as far as Q&A goes, or further resources, you can read more about Semgrep supply chain. And of course, CramHacks, if you're looking for takes like these on a weekly basis. I also cover just all things open source security, software supply chain security. Really, it's just whatever I found interesting in the week, I write about. Great. Well, thanks, everyone.